I don't believe that students should be treated differently based on their race. Hopefully, this case will end racial classifications and preferences in admissions at the University of Texas.
When I heard Judge Scalia suggest that maybe blacks do better at schools that are not as fast as UT, I didn't know if I was in the courtroom at the United States Supreme Court or at a Donald Trump rally.
You cannot cure racial discrimination that occurred in the past with new discrimination today. Race and ethnicity have no place in American life and law. The text of the Civil Rights Act, Title VI, specifically says that race and ethnicity must not be a factor in educational endeavors. It's quite simple, and the court has recognized that it is quite simple. There cannot be a carve-out for what is now called, basically skin color diversity. When we talk about diversity, we're not talking about individualized characteristics of individual students. We're talking about how they look. And what the diversity movement really fails to understand is that how a student looks doesn't tell us anything about who that student is, what's important to that student, the various qualifications and interests, likes and dislikes. I grew up in the 1960s. I grew up in a liberal Jewish household where civil rights and the civil rights movement was an important aspect of our family conversation. I was a teenager at the time that the Civil Rights Act was passed. This was something that many of my friends grew up with. My parents talked about, our rabbis addressed in synagogue. So it's something that from the time I was just a young 12, 13, 14-year-old, I've been aware of the challenges that America faces when it comes to race and ethnicity.
The society has got this complicated history, great and tragic. And that comes up in course after course after course in life. And if you're not, in any way exposed to that from different experiences of that history and that present, you're not an educated person. I mean, you're a person who has lived in a kind of elite bubble where you can think about things, but you don't have to really confront them. You can't deny that there has been real improvement and significant improvement due to the efforts of universities to try to make sure that there's a level playing field. So if you say that all has to come to an end, then you are reversing a half century of really important efforts to provide a better education, provide better society, and opportunities, and that's a very, very substantial, significant change in American history and the trajectory of the country. Of course, we don't know whether the court will do that, and we also we can anticipate the effects of a overruling of Grutter because we have the actual examples of University of California, Berkeley, and University of Michigan, and so on, where affirmative action has been ended because of state actions within those states. And we can see a really tragic falling of diversity in those institutions. They're very, very concerned about it. If that spread across the whole country, it would be a reshaping of American higher education.
I identify as Nepali American. I'm a low-income student as well. And for me, the narrative that I'm seeing in the media on Asian American students, the narrative that Students for Fair Admissions and Ed Blum are trying to spread about Asian American students is something that's certainly doesn't fit my story, the story of my family, and the story of the Asian American community that I grew up knowing. So I felt a responsibility to stand up and call that out. A ruling from the Supreme Court against the constitutionality of affirmative action would definitely not mean that it's the end of my organizing or the organizing of the 25 amici groups that signed on to the brief. The fight continues, and there are so many different things that we're continuing to work on at Harvard and beyond to make elite schools, to make higher education a more affirming place for students of marginalized backgrounds. Affirmative action is only one piece, and we can't lose sight of the other pieces of this fight. The reason why I'm proud to stand in support of affirmative action is because I also know that race consciousness does not mean that the only thing schools are looking at is race. We're looking at race, or Harvard and other schools in this country are looking at race as one of many different factors in a student's application file. Sometimes race might tip the scale when students who are being compared have very similar like experiences, have had very similar successes throughout high school. But that doesn't mean that there's a blanket policy that Asian students are not going to get in because, they're being held to a higher academic standard, and that Black and Latina students are going to be accepted at a higher rate just because of a racial preference that's being practiced by these colleges. That's not at all the case, and that's never been the case in a holistic college admissions practice. So I think it's really important that people understand the facts, and they're able to pivot away from the honestly propaganda that Students for Fair Admissions is trying to spread, trying to divide our communities with, to look at the decades of precedent from Bakke to Grutter to just everything that we've been experiencing in the past few decades with affirmative action in the Supreme Court, that race is a suspect class that must be used in a very narrow, tailored fashion. And Harvard has been abiding by those rules, and other schools, UNC, they have all been abiding by those rules of making sure that they're including race as one aspect of a holistic admissions process.
We're working on a fast change time, so do you guys mind coming back out? Because like the bands will be completed, but we don't, like we still want to do what we I know some people want to like more. Awesome, thank you. As a first generation student, I felt like that I didn't have much knowledge about the college application. Like my dad, he came from China when he was like 17 or 18, and so did my mom, and they finished their high school diplomas. And so being a first generation student trying to navigate this, I didn't really have the understanding. I really focused on like Asian American activism, which was an avenue that I really stood out in, and talking about my race and identity and my struggle with being an Asian American in a predominantly white community and talking about that in my application, and being that like after being able to look at my application after, and this was something that they pointed out that was stood out in my application, and it's something that advocates before me fought really hard for, to make sure that I have a place at a university like UNC, and I feel like I doing like, even though my test scores didn't really match up to some of my classmates that may have applied to UNC, but I'm still able to thrive here. And I think it's because you've literally sitting there for hours. It's just rooted in anti-Blackness and using Asian Americans as a racial wedge to bring in like to bring down other races and to continue like almost white supremacy, because Asian Americans have been using affirmative action for decades. I think when people are having this rhetoric that they're taking away spots from more deserving, like that's rooted in racism.
No more racial quota! No more racial quota! Equal opportunity for all! Equal opportunity for all!
Stop discrimination!
Stop discrimination!
Support inclusive diversity!